The title of this story is Pity This Busy Monster Not. And I'll point out that there's some things that you would see if you were reading it in front of you that you won't see because I'm reading it aloud. One, there are breaks between scenes. I'll take a pause when those breaks occur. And also, there's a scene or two that has dialogue without attribution, just alternating dialogue. And reading in the story, you would know that with quote marks, who's speaking and one person is speaking, the other person is not. I will attempt to just make sure that the voices are a little different so that you'll know as the conversation is occurring that we've shifted to that scene. But anyway, it'll be in Adam's Ladder out next month. It's called Pity This Busy Monster Not. Julian found himself sitting at a narrow counter which ran along the coffee shop's front window, a coffee shop which he knew should have been familiar to him, even though it was not. His head was down as he frowned while working with too great an effort on what should have been an easy crossword puzzle. He was frowning twice over, in fact, for he wasn't just frowning because he found the clues which ran down the page to be tough ones. He was also frowning about even frowning over that crossword puzzle, for as far as he knew he didn't like crossword puzzles, at least not that he remembered, which explained, he guessed, why he also couldn't recall ever attempting to do one. Actually, he wasn't quite sure what he liked or didn't like, was only sure that he shouldn't examine too closely the nature of his uncertainty just then, so he returned to his struggling, a mental exercise accompanied by gently tapping the cap of his pen against his lip, a habit he found comfortable and recognized as his own, even though he had no idea why, when, or where the gesture had become his in the first place. He searched his memory, which he knew in his heart. He had a heart, didn't he? Yes, he felt it right there beating, to be wide and deep, though he clearly had no true proof of that in this instant. To remember the name of a certain actress from a certain movie made during a certain year. This attempted dive into the past made his head hurt because somehow he knew, somehow he was aware that he should have remembered information like that easily. He'd always had before, hadn't he? Though he wasn't sure how it should be possible to remember that remembering while at the same time having no clue as to the information itself. Sighing, he lifted his gaze for a moment from the newspaper. It had been the only moment he'd raised his head since sitting down with his puzzle and his coffee and his banana nut muffin, and in that moment he chose to glance out the large front window and onto the street. He could have looked elsewhere in that instant. He could have turned his head perhaps, looked to his right, studied a wall decorated by a trompe-l'oeil mural of coffee beans growing on a hillside, or he might have tilted his head back and looked up and admired the fanciful lighting fixture formed there by a spiral of glowing coffee cups. But no, instead he chose that moment to stare straight ahead, to feel the sun on his face for what seemed like the first time, and so he, not just for what seemed like the first time, but for what actually was the first time, saw her. Had he changed this element of his posture a moment earlier, she wouldn't have yet reached that narrow stretch of side street, and so he'd have lowered his gaze before she passed, missing her. If he'd stirred himself a moment later, she'd have already been gone, having turned a corner, escaped the moment of their maybe, never to be seen by him. But luckily for him, luckily for her, the puzzle which had been confounding him disturbed him just enough that he looked up at exactly the right moment. As he saw her, this woman he would have sworn he knew and swear he didn't know, it seemed to him as if she contained not just all that mattered in the universe, but all the matter in the universe. His body grew suddenly too tight to contain his soul, and he feared that if he stared at her any longer, if she did not pass quickly from his field of vision, her presence would burst him from his skin and split his shell to tatters. But his heart was pounding now in a way he'd never felt a heart pound before, making him aware of its presence with an urgency he'd never known, so he had to dare it anyway. He would not look away. He could not look away. And then he didn't have to look away. She was gone. He dropped his pen and dashed out to the street, leaving his muffin barely nibbled, his coffee hardly sipped. But once there, he was unable to spot her in any direction. As he scanned the city, a city in which he'd spent his entire life, it did not seem familiar to him the way he knew it should, and now, because of her, he assumed, it was only an impediment, a maze, its marvels meaningless and not worth his time, because of her. If the woman he saw had already entered a building, he knew he'd have lost his only chance, would never find her again, but perhaps, oh perhaps, if only she turned the corner. He hesitated for the merest fraction of a second, trying to make in that infinitesimal fraction of time one so small it didn't seem possible for a human to measure it, what he knew would be his life's most important decision, which way to run. Then he simply ran, knowing he had time for but one choice, knowing that if he'd chosen wrong, this would be the end of it, though an end he would never forget, and so no end at all. He reached the street which instinct or something grander had headed him toward, looked in one direction and saw nothing but a string of food trucks mobbed by a crowd he could immediately tell did not contain her. But then he looked the other way. When he looked the other way, there she was. He'd made the right choice, or perhaps the universe had made the right choice for him. He'd have looked skyward and said thank you if he believed there was anything to which to say thank you. After he called out to her, the expression revealed to him on her face when she turned told him, however, she didn't at all think he'd made the right choice. Barbara had had enough of strange men calling out to her on the street as if they had a right to, shouted at by so many she couldn't remember them all even if she'd wanted to, which she did not. So she had made it a habit now to ignore them and to make it seem at the same time as if she wasn't ignoring them, merely as if she never heard. Life was easier that way, safer too. She knew that, even though she wasn't sure how she knew that, couldn't conjure up more than just a few of their faces, even though she'd have thought they'd be burned into her memories. But if her mind wanted to forget things, if her memory had become porous, she figured there had to be a good reason, whether she could extract that reason or not. So she let go of the attempt to remember which the cry from behind her had raised. This time, as opposed to all the other times except for the first, which she was aware of instantly without really remembering, she decided to turn, to confront. Though the words said by the man behind her weren't by themselves offensive, his call had come when she had just about enough. He hadn't been the first that day, at least she thought he hadn't been the first that day, so who it was and what was said this time didn't really matter. She'd had enough, and though she wasn't sure what she was going to say, she was going to say something. But when she spun, ready to speak and trusting the words would be there when she needed them, she couldn't tell at first which of the others on the street had even been the one to accost her, as no one was looking directly at her. The dozen or so people were mostly in motion, hurrying for their destinations with none headed toward her, while the ones who vibrated in place were all occupied by tasks which had nothing to do with her, hailing a cab, studying a storefront, lighting a cigarette. But the way his voice had reverberated so recently and so close behind, she knew he must still be there and realized that it had to be him, the man looking down in confusion at a newspaper in his hand, as if he'd forgotten it was there, as if its presence had distracted him and caused him to forget she was even there. But then he looked up and saw her, and she could see him remembering where he was and why he was, see a smile blossom across his face from that remembering. A smile, not the leer she'd come to expect from a string of faces she couldn't conjure up. And why not? Better not to ask, she knew. He lifted the newspaper, shook it slightly so her eyes were drawn to a partially completed crossword puzzle, and asked whether she knew the name of a certain actress from a certain movie made during a certain year. A question which took her aback because both it was so unlike anything a stranger had ever said to her, but also because she did know the name of that certain actress who'd starred in that certain movie made in that certain year. Why, she'd been discussing it just the night before with one of her girlfriends. How remarkable was that? So she told him. His smile grew wider, a smile of happiness that she was right, not only in her answer, but right. He then looked at his other hand, the one not holding a puzzle, and smiled a different smile, a crooked smile, and asked whether she had a pen he could borrow. He stepped closer and ran a finger down the column where the name of the actress she'd given him should go. She shook her head, apologized, telling her it had been a long time since she'd had to write anything down that couldn't be done electronically. Writing with ink on paper seemed like something an ancient people would have done. It seemed longer ago to her than it actually was. She knew that, but she didn't really care. Oh, it wasn't quite as old as that, he told her, then pointed at an empty corner of the puzzle and tapped the clues that went with it. He wondered whether she'd care to help him further. He knew of a coffee shop around the corner where they brewed excellent coffee, and the muffins weren't that bad either, and if they were lucky, no one would have yet thrown away the penny left behind. She looked at him, and for the first and last and only time, she was surprisingly uncertain of many things this morning, but not of that, thought, oh, why not? That didn't seem right. Did you really expect it would? It was a long time ago. What are you saying? That just because that was then and this is now, nothing needs to make sense? How did he know which way to go to catch up with her? How did she know to stay after he found her? How did he know she was the one? How did she know he was the one? How did either of them know anything? They just knew. It doesn't seem possible. They didn't have enough information to be able to know, not the way they were constructed in the old days. They didn't have the tools, and even if they had them, they wouldn't have known how to use them. Maybe it's not that. Maybe we're reading them wrong. The information that survived from those times is incomplete, you know, so when we reanimate them, when we inhabit them, there are gaps. We might not be getting a complete and accurate picture. Well, they did seem awfully uncertain at times. And whether our knowledge of them is fragmented or not, how can their knowing what they knew of each other be the thing that disturbs you? And not that he was struggling to complete that puzzle when the answers should have been immediately accessible from the air around him. Not that he was having to eat and drink. What were those things they put in their mouths anyway in order to continue living? Not all those cars they needed to move from place to place, or their inability to fight the force which kept them pinned to their planet. I'd almost forgotten all those things. And I couldn't remember any of them. But those mysteries made far more sense than this knowing what could not possibly be known. But the question is, did any of that or the others we reconstructed and ran simultaneously help you decide? You've been delaying this for eons. Time's infinite, we won't run out of it. Infinity, it's the only thing we won't run out of. I think we need to see more, to be more, no need to be hasty. If you say so, do you disagree? Once we proceed, once a decision is made, there's no going back. I neither agree nor disagree, I'm merely patient. Then let's keep going. Sylvia couldn't open her eyes, even though she wanted, oh how she wanted to open them, but she was unable to summon the strength, barely had enough even for a coherent thought, and yet she was still aware, though she was uncertain how she was aware, as she hadn't raised her lids once since entering the room, that the darkness without matched her darkness within. Only a few blinking lights kept that darkness from being total. She knew that as well, even though she'd never seen the blink, not even when her lids were intermittently lifted so her condition could be checked, for her eyes, well, they were beyond seeing. Those lights twinkled like stars, stars that felt like home, stars that comforted her as if she had always lived among them, stars she knew very well as she knew her own soul without knowing how she knew them very well. Their glow cast barely perceptible shadows upon her face, a face smoother than she thought it would remain for it to have ended up in a place like this. Not that she'd ever thought she'd end up in a place like this. They'd made themselves a promise, the two of them, she and her lover, that neither ever would. They'd made a pact, in fact, one they'd hoped they'd never need, but swore to each other would be fulfilled if necessary. But then life intervened, speeding up and sneaking upon them before they saw it coming, and they had no choice. And now that Sylvia was beyond doing any of the choosing, Jane, poor Jane, had to do the choosing for her. Unable to see, unable to move, there was little for Sylvia to do save listen to the hums, the whirs, the beeps of the sustaining machines which surrounded her, and the answering call and response of the meat symphony within, the air passing through her lungs, the blood coursing through her veins, the crackle of electricity allowing her to think those thoughts, none moving with the force they once had, but with enough, just enough. She was amazed that body continued to function at all, even as a part of her, a part she'd never noticed before, was also amazed that it had ever functioned in the first place. Bodies were messy things, and that hers had survived this long as a vehicle for the part that mattered was miraculous. She became aware that beneath those sounds, barely audible, hid the sound of crying. As that sound came closer, grew louder, she recognized the maker of them. She wanted to sit up, to reach out, to place a hand against a cheek, to make the tears stop, but she could do none of those things. She could only lie there, as she knew one of them eventually would, and listen and be grateful. She'd known this was coming. It was foretold by the promise they'd made, but that didn't make it any less of a surprise when it finally arrived. She could hear the weeping grow louder, though no closer, for they were already close enough that she could feel dampness on her face, tears which were not her own, and she knew that if she opened her own eyes, if she could somehow regain that power, she would see her eyes, the eyes of the one she knew so well, the eyes she'd chosen to gaze into forever, a forever which had been sadly shortened, above her, damp and overflowing. But though she strained, though she exerted all that remained within her, she could not even do that. She hoped her lover knew she'd do that if she could. She knew her lover knew she'd do that if she could, and knew it with a certainty which made all her earlier certainties only faith. Then, interrupting the reunion, there rose the voice of another, a stern voice, and when it spoke with words Sylvia could not make out, that crying stopped for a moment. So there came a deafening silence which was almost unbearable. But then a cacophony followed to fill it which was more painful than the silence. Yelling, both from the one she loved and from an angry voice, no, two angry voices, neither of which he recognized. The voices grew louder, but no matter how much she concentrated, she could not understand what they were saying, for she was beyond concentration, beyond understanding. She was adrift in a sea of her brain's own making, and as she struggled to make sense of the world around her, a world she could not see, but felt as if another would let her, she could. Those voices grew guttural, grunting rather than speaking, and then her bed shook as if others were bumping against it, others she could not stop, wrestling with another she could not protect, and tried in the center of this chaos with all her soul, all her remaining will, to rise, to help, to protect, but could not. For whatever remained of her was simply not enough. And then the room was silent again, silent save for the sounds of the gleaming machinery without, which tried to keep her from dying, and messy machinery within, which was doing its best to disobey. A room in which, though together they'd chosen another path, she knew she would die alone. Jane had never done anything illegal in her life, well, except for the way she lived her life, but why should that be illegal? They had no right. And now this was the time to take that step because something illegal was being done to her. Well, not illegal, not literally illegal, but definitely immoral and definitely something that should have been made illegal long ago and someday would be. She knew that with a certainty, wishful thinking aside, knew that humanity would one day be beyond this, beyond barriers of laws, of concrete, of flesh. Of flesh? Though she was unsure why that certainty beyond faith should be instilled in her now, considering how bleak things looked, considering what she was considering doing. More than merely considering, actually doing. That's what they had pushed her to. She brought an outfit that looked like something she thought a nurse would wear, wriggled into it in her car in the hospital parking lot, waited at night until she saw a legitimate nurse step outside for a cigarette break, and then slipped past her and inside before the door could shut, into the hospital where she was forbidden to be. The hospital where a photo of her was pinned to the wall by the front security desk, where Sylvia lay in a bed, her wishes ignored, being kept alive in a way she would never have chosen. Nothing was going to keep the two of them separate. Nothing was going to keep Jane from doing what her love alone could not. Nothing. The corridor revealed off the rear lot was unfamiliar to her, looking nothing like the maze beyond the front entrance out of which she'd been escorted so many times. She felt lost, but it was necessary that she feel lost. For here there were no guards to stop her from wandering, and that was all that mattered. She trusted she'd find her way. She'd been lost before she found Sylvia, and yet she found her, hadn't she? Being lost was but the temporary stage before what mattered. The world would not be so unkind as to prevent her from fulfilling her mission. She entered a stairwell. She didn't feel she could dare risk one of the elevators, worried she'd be too visible there, and walked up with what she hoped would seem to anyone who saw her to be a nurse's determination rather than a mad woman's urgency. No one spotted her, though, and so she made it safely to what she remembered as Sylvia's floor. Then a wave of horror passed through her as she thought, what if they'd moved her in the week since her last visit? But surely they wouldn't have, for where else would they have moved her to? The hospital was already doing all it could, and Sylvia wasn't going to get better, so there was only one other place for Sylvia to move on to from there, and Jane didn't want to have to think about it. Not yet. Not until she had to. Because it would have meant Jane had failed her, and she wasn't sure she could bear it knowing that. But at least she wouldn't have to bear it for long. She exited on a corridor without a view of the nursing station, for which she was grateful, as she could probably be taken as a nurse by those who'd never seen her face before, but not them, and made it to the remembered room with no false turns, which surprised her, because luck was never usually on her side, well, except for having found Sylvia. She lay in the bed in the dark, her breathing more a series of rhythmic gasps than the gentle flow of air, the sound of which had helped Jane fall asleep all the years since they'd gotten together. Wires and tubes led from the body she knew so well to the machines which surrounded her. Her eyes were closed, her face expressionless. Somewhere inside was Sylvia, but her body, it could have passed for dead. This was the end they promised they'd keep from each other. They had a pact, a promise they'd never let it progress like this, never let these people get their hands on either one of them. Though if she were honest with herself, Jane, being the older of the two, had always thought if they erred and let things get this far, she'd be the one in the hospital bed, with Sylvia doing for her what she couldn't do for herself, but one doesn't get to choose. She stood by Sylvia's side, ready for what she was meant to do, but found herself unable to reach into her pocket for the hypodermic. It had to be done, she knew it had to be done, but her hands would not obey. All she could do was cry. Her tears struck Sylvia's cheek, making it appear as if she were the one crying. She wondered whether Sylvia could sense the dampness on her face. She wondered whether Sylvia even knew Jane was there, whether either of them was there. Neither of them believed there was anything after this life. They discussed the matter many times, but as there would soon be nothing left of this one, Jane knew she'd better start pretending. She was about to place a hand against her lover's cheek to draw strength for the next step when the door behind her slammed open. She knew they'd come, so that was no surprise. She just didn't know they'd come so soon. Before they could reach her, she grabbed the railing on Sylvia's bed with one hand while simultaneously reaching into a pocket for the handcuffs, which she slammed down against her other wrist. But she wasn't fast enough, and before she could attach herself to the bed, they pulled at her arm and twisted it behind her back. They knew who she was, shouting her name, shouting other things which she couldn't believe they dared to shout, words she'd been called many times before, but not here, not now. Jane went limp, dropping to the ground, uncertain even as she fell whether she'd done it deliberately to prevent herself from being dragged off or if her knees had buckled from the rush of emotions. Down on the linoleum, curled into a ball, she screamed at them, cursed them, demanded they think about what they were doing, but none of them stopped them doing it, no matter how loudly she insisted she loved Sylvia, how they couldn't possibly be so inhumane, how they should let the two of them be, regardless of what Jane's estranged family had insisted. Couldn't they see? Didn't they understand? They would all someday. She knew it, but that helped little now. They ignored her words as they yanked her to the door. And as she was pulled from the room, she kept fighting, kept foolishly hoping they'd find it in their hearts to let her fulfill her promise, but most of all kept her eyes on Jane, only on Jane, until the door slammed shut and she saw her no more. That was terrible. It can't possibly be true, can it? Were they really once like that? Were we really once like that? Once like what? Bound in bodies? Or blind to what that imprisonment did to them? Both, I fear. But it doesn't matter whether it's true or not. We're beyond that. We don't need to have anything to do with them. That's not really something we can choose. They either were us or were not. Facts are facts. History is history. It's not a matter of choice. Of course we can choose. We're no more required to believe in them than we are to accept the truth of a myth or the laws laid down by our religion. Besides, the information we have, who knows whether it's accurate? There are holes, there are mysteries. Didn't you sense them? Our presence, it seemed to be filling those holes. We're doing more than watching untampered recreations. We became a part of them. We're not the only ones sensing things. Didn't you sense them sensing us? They're aware of what we're doing. They're aware of what we're trying to decide. So we're not getting a perfect picture of how they really were. The evidence that was left behind by those we once were, we've tampered with it, infected it. Our trail from there to here is no longer true. Oh, there's been some transference, perhaps. They surely did not have that certainty we're picking up about times to come. Our times, we're bleeding through, but enough of it remains true, enough for you to decide. I know. You still have to decide. Yes, I know. So we can be what we want to be. We can be what we are. We already are what we are. But that's not what this has been about. That's not what we're trying to decide. We've been embodying them to determine whether to become what we are not yet. I don't know that we're ready. Then it's a good thing we have all the time in the universe, time enough to replay every one of them if necessary. I'm not sure I could bear many more of them. They feel so constricting. How were they ever able to stand it? We at least have a choice, but they had none. It doesn't seem as if they could stand it. Maybe that's what drove them mad. Maybe that's why we too are all that's left, but that doesn't matter now. What matters is, since you've yet to decide, do we dive in for more? We must. We'll dive. We'll learn. We'll choose. And I must stop there. Time for the next one. It goes on. If you want to find out what's really going on and where this all ends up, it's in Adam's Ladder, which is an anthology from Written Backwards Press that goes on sale in the middle of October. Maybe just a week or two from now, copies will start being shipped out. So thank you for coming. And the title of the story again is Pity This Busy Monster Not, that some of you may recognize. It's from a poem by E. Cummings. I don't know if you ever... Pity This Busy Monster, Man Unkind. That's where I got the title of that one. So thank you very much. Take another chocolate before you go to sustain you through the long evening ahead.